Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to Drums and Drams. My name's Cameron, and today I'm gonna be going through the 7 bourbons that you see in front of me here. For each of these bottles, I'm gonna nose it very quickly, take a sip, and give you a super short review. And at the end of each of those reviews, I'm gonna assign a numerical score out of 100, with the whole point of this being to sort of establish a baseline of scores here for the channel. Now, scoring whiskey is not something that I've traditionally done with my reviews. In the past, I dabbled with it, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago at this point, and I never felt like I really had the expertise to do that, and I don't feel like I have a ton of expertise at this point either, but at least, 3 or 4 years later, I've tasted a whole heck of a lot more whiskey, really the worst of the worst, in my opinion, and also I feel like I've had some of the best whiskey that's probably ever been produced. There's of course always something better, there's always something worse, but I feel like at this point I have a pretty large data set, in my brain to kind of work with, and I feel like I could accurately assign, or at least semi-accurately assign scores to whiskeys. Now, of course, this is an unblind tasting, and so I'm gonna do my best to not have value and price factor into this, but of course, maybe I'm a little bit biased when I do know what I'm sipping. But as I go throughout the year and hopefully years down the road, I'll taste things not only unblind like this, but also blind as well, and try to get a more accurate view of what I think about a whiskey over several tastings over several months. And I'm gonna keep track of all of that in sort of like a Google spreadsheet, and I'm gonna share that with my Patreon members. Now, this is the long way of saying that today I'm gonna just do a super short review of these 7 bourbons. Again, setting a baseline. You guys can tell me in the comments section if you agree with the ratings that I give these whiskeys today. And as far as the rating system goes, I'm working out of 100, and I'm really stealing from that kind of Robert Parker 100-point wine scoring system that he uses. You can go online and read about it, but I'll do my best to add into the description of every video my own system, kind of how I'm categorizing things, essentially from a 59 out of 100, because if it's anything lower than that, it's really not great, all the way up to 100, and you'll see more details about that. We're gonna start with the Old Forester 86. We're gonna move up to Russell's 15. I did my best to make these, kind of a range of different options, different distilleries, proof points, ages, and also price points, while trying to really maintain a more accessible whiskey as much as I possibly could. So I think that's all I need to say here at the beginning of this video. Let me know if you guys like the idea of doing ratings, what you think about this, but for me, I'm pretty sold on at least making this an experiment for the rest of 2025. So let's go on now. We're gonna start with the Old Forester 86 proof, non-age stated. Let's check it out on the nose. All right, so on the nose, this is a very kind of down the middle, average, but uneventful kind of whiskey at 86 proof, and that makes sense. This is super affordable. It's a value buy. You get those traditional Old Forester notes of kind of like banana, a little bit of like a youthful, yeasty quality, which again is sort of a standard for Old Forester and Brown-Forman more broadly. It's simple, it's sweet on that note, a little bit of vanilla sweetness in here too, but not complex on the nose. You don't really expect it to be given the price point and the availability, the proof point, all that kind of stuff. Let's go to the palate now. Yeah, and the palate definitely follows the nose on this one. This is a simple, approachable, kind of entry-level whiskey, I would say, and you don't really expect anything else from this. It does what it needs to do, and then it gets out of the way. There's not a long finish by any means, very short, kind of a flash of sweet flavor on the palate. So for me, this epitomizes a 70 out of 100 on my rating scale, which is kind of on the cusp of just the most average whiskey you could possibly have without falling into that almost like deficient or like there's something wrong with it, which would be 60 through 69 on my rating scale. So I'm gonna go 70 out of 100 on this Old Forester. I think that's a super fair score. Nothing wrong with it. It gets the job done. Now it's time to go to Old Grandad 114, which is about $30 to $35 depending on where you're at. We've got a much higher proof here, 28 proof points higher. This is coming from Jim Beam, high rye mash bill. Everybody talks about OGD114 as being like an ultimate value whiskey. And I think that's true in some ways and maybe not in others. So I think this is gonna be an interesting, kind of an interesting evaluation. Let's see how it does on my rating scale compared to the Old Forester 86. All right, so there's a lot more going on with the nose of this Old Grandad as compared to the Old Forester, but it's not necessarily in a complexity way. It's mostly just in a pure intensity and spice kind of way. And that's not only because of the proof jump that we have here, which is significant, but also I think because of that high rye mash bill and the fact that we have a Jim Beam product, which just naturally has a little bit more spice to it. So what I get on the nose of this Old Grandad yes, is some quintessential, Jim Beam nuttiness. But actually, I think that takes a backseat in this case to just a very heavy cinnamon forward profile. Like, this feels dense and heavy, but not necessarily rich. It feels kind of spiky and brash. Again, driven by cinnamon, but there are also some other notes in here as well. There's a little sweet brown sugar kind of quality, and also something that I get sometimes on these Beam products, which is like this earthy, almost mulch character, like an earthy mulch. I picked this up sometimes on the old Overholt cask strength rye. They've done a 10 and 11 year of that so far. So for what it's worth, this is spicy, it is brash, intense. I think for me, I like the nose a little bit better than the Old Forester, but not significantly better. It's just more intense, and I think it's probably gonna be more flavorful on the palate, so we're gonna get to that here in just a second. But I don't feel like this is light years ahead of the Old Forester 86. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Here we go to the palate now. Yeah, so I actually think this Old Grandad has some similarities to the Old Forester on the palate. And I'm not talking about its flavor profile or its spiciness or its intensity. I'm really just talking about its lack of complexity. So on the palate, just as it was on the nose, this is a laser-focused cinnamon bomb of a whiskey with a little bit of sweetness to back it up, not a lot. Tons of youthful brash spice. It's very much a what you see is what you get kind of experience. Once you smell it, you know what you're in for on the palate, and it delivers. It really does. You have a longer finish here, which does count for something. It's not my favorite flavor profile, if I'm being honest, but I do think it's a great example of a 73 out of 100 kind of whiskey. You could say 72, you could say 74. I'm gonna give it 73 today. Let me know what you guys think about that. But now it's time to move on to everybody's favorite. This is the fan favorite, Wild Turkey Rare Breed. This is a 116.8 proof blend, I believe, of 6 to 12 year Wild Turkey bourbon, which is a mash bill of 75% corn, 13% rye, 12% malted barley. It is typically about $50 if you find it at SRP, and I can't imagine why you wouldn't find it at that price. And one other thing to note about this is just that there's a little bit of, fluctuation from batch to batch, and that's gonna happen with any of these products, right? Like, whether it's a 10 barrel blend or a 100 barrel blend or a 1,000 barrel blend, you're talking about bourbon, you're talking about whiskey. It's kind of a living and breathing thing in the barrel, and those barrels can vary quite a bit from one to the other. And so when you batch them together, you might get some variance, and Rare Breed is definitely no exception. Over the years, people will track down laser codes, and they'll talk about this laser code being better than this one, and I love my fair share of laser codes, don't get me wrong, but I've never been somebody to do that with Rare Breed. Although I will say I've noticed a decline in quality since, I would say, about 2019-ish. It feels like it's kind of fallen off a little bit. And I really like those 2019 and maybe 2020 batches more than this one. Now, this is a 2024 release, so just keep that in mind. So let's go to the nose now for this Rare Breed and see what we get. So what I love about Wild Turkey Rare Breed is that at this price point, which is, again, around $50, you start to get into a more complex experience. It's the complaint that I had against the last two bourbons in this lineup here. But with this Rare Breed, you start to feel like there are layers to this whiskey on the nose. Like for me, I do get a little bit still of like a youthful brash spice note. That's what I kind of picked up on the OGD114, although that one is much heavier spice. And the Rare Breed is a little bit more prickly and kind of dialed back and refined, not as in your face, not as like almost like bittersweet in some ways. But this also has a nice kind of citrus layer to it. There's a little bit of like an orange, maybe like an orange peel kind of note in here. You do get a nice little bit of like a, standard Kentucky bourbon caramel kind of profile as well. But you also get a little red fruit too. So there's like a fruitiness. There are these more sour, citrusy, bright fruit notes. There's a peppery spice. There's also a little bit of richness. But I think the most important thing and the coolest aspect of this whiskey, even though it's subtle, is that kind of underneath all of that, you get an underpinning of oak. It's the first time I've really picked up on a distinctly, aged oak component, even if it's like 5% in the background. You don't really get that on these first two whiskeys. And with the Rare Breed, that oakiness kind of helps to, again, demonstrate complexity. And along with that oakiness, there's a little bit of like this smoky or char kind of note in there as well. So I like the layers. It still feels kind of youthful, still feels like it's jumping out of the glass, and it's got a lot to say, you know what I mean? So with that said, let's go to the palate now. So look guys, there's a reason this is a fan favorite $50 barrel proof bourbon, and it's not only because of the complexity that I talked about on the nose, which definitely does translate to the palate, but it's also because that complexity is delivered at 116.8 proof. It's a full-bodied, intense drinking experience, and I think it's almost like a gateway drug to maybe slightly more expensive and slightly higher proof barrel proof bourbons. And I think if you look at the Old Grandad 114 and you think, well, maybe this is kind of a gateway drug for newer drinkers to try to get into like, higher proof pours. For me, this kind of turns me off a little bit just because it's heavily kind of bittersweet. The cinnamon is just way overdone. And I actually think it could put people off of chasing higher proof stuff if they're thinking about it. Whereas the Rare Breed has so many different layers. I mean, it's not the most complex thing ever, but there's a lot to love in it, and a lot of different things to love for different kinds of drinkers who want to latch on to either the fruit, the citrus, the spice, the oak, any of those things. And so I think if they taste this Rare Breed, and again, it's like their 10th pour they've ever had, they might go, hey, next time I'm gonna go $20 higher and 15 proof points higher, and I'm gonna shoot for an Elijah Craig barrel proof. Now, with that said, I should give you a couple of tasting notes, right? So at the front of the palate on this Rare Breed, it's very pop roxy, prickly pepper, oak spice kind of thing going on. And then there's a flash of red fruit right after that spice kind of dies down. That red fruit kind of joins together with that citrus note I talked about on the nose. Then you get a little sweetness on the mid palate, which is kind of that caramel note. As you get into the finish, the spice is definitely still hanging on. It's driving that finish into a little, smoky char kind of oak profile. And it's a long finish. So Rare Breed, very solid. This is not the best batch, but I think because it's an average moving into pretty good territory, there's no better score than 75 out of 100 for something like that. It's the most perfect, C if you're looking at like a grading scale. So now let's move on to the Weller Antique 107. This is a 107 proof, non-age stated, wheated Buffalo Trace bourbon. This is typically gonna run you about 50 to 60 bucks if you find it at SRP. Although I think secondary nowadays is between like 85 to 105. Some stores are gonna see this for 150, 200. Absolutely don't buy it at that price point. I've always liked 107. I've never loved 107, so keep that in mind as I do taste this. I might be a little bit biased, but I'll do my best. Let's go to the nose now. All right, so this Weller Antique actually smells pretty darn good. It's got a ton of that traditional Buffalo Trace honey sweetness on the nose. There's also a nice little bit of like this summer fruit kind of vibe. It's a mixture of like that brighter sort of cherry note, which is not unlike what Rare Breed had, but Rare Breed does not have as much of it by any means. This Weller is a much sweeter, much more round experience on the nose. There's none of that brash, kind of youthful spice, and it's a wheated bourbon and it's Buffalo Trace, both of those things meaning that it's going to be extremely sweet, and it does come off that way on the nose. While you don't get as much like char and spice and aged oak as I got on the Rare Breed, what the Weller does is it kind of brings things together in a more cohesive way. So there might be slightly less complexity to the nose. I think it is more of like a unified profile, but at the same time, it feels like it's so well put together. And actually the proof point, I know it's not barrel proof, it's a little bit lower than the 116.8 of the Rare Breed. Even so, it smells maybe even better for it, because I think adding that water has sort of tamed down some of that youthful spice that you get on the Rare Breed and on the Old Grandad as well. I do really like the nose of this. I've gotta say, I prefer it over the Rare Breed, which is kind of crazy for me because I'm not somebody that chases after this Weller stuff. But let's see on the palate now. I'm not gonna, judge a book by its cover yet. We've got to taste this thing. Here we go. Well, unfortunately, this whiskey is showing me right now why so many people just chase after it and love it. No, it is not the most special thing in the world, but it tastes freaking great, and you can't argue with the fact that it's very sweet. It's so approachable and inviting and delicious, and it makes you want to go back for more. It's not the longest finish by any stretch of the imagination, and I think that's because you're dealing with a wheated bourbon. You're dealing with a 107 proof bourbon, not something that's cask strength. But my God, I mean, it's just sweet vanilla, and it's custardy with, again, some of those like summer fruit notes I'm getting on here, and that sweet Buffalo Trace oak that just kind of hangs out in the background and really supports everything going on here. You can't really argue with this. It's not perfect, and it's definitely not worthy of something in the 80s, but I think this is right on the cusp of that. So I would give Weller Antique, at least right now, knowing that I've previously been a little bit of a hater, I'm gonna give this a 79 out of 100. I think it's right on the cusp of moving into that next category for me and my rating scale. But if I had this blind, I'd be really interested to see, you know, where this falls. I think it could actually maybe move up a point or two, but that's not for me to speculate on today. So now let's go on to what I think is still kind of an underrated and underappreciated bourbon, and that's Knob Creek's 12-year, 100 proof, Kentucky straight bourbon. This is about $60 or $70 if you find it at the right price. No real secondary value, just sometimes a silly store here and there that wants to charge you $125, which is like, I don't understand that. Generally pretty available, like pretty shelf stable across the country. Only, a few markets I feel like don't see this regularly. Ohio sometimes being one of them, actually. 12 years, this is the highest age statement so far, maybe actually the only age statement so far. Let's see how that impacts the whiskey. Here we go. Listen, guys, I absolutely love Knob Creek 12. I'm not ashamed to say that. I also love Knob Creek 18. 15 is fine, but 18 is fantastic. A little more expensive than this, right? That's about $180, but this at $60 to $70 for Knob Creek 12-year, the nose is fantastic. Like, this is the first time in this tasting, and I think will be many people's first time actually when they're looking at products to buy at this price point that are readily available, at their local liquor store. I think it's the first time that you're gonna get a heavy oak influence, and it's gonna be a love-hate thing. I think many folks will smell this and be like, whoa, that smells like a tree, like a wet tree. And you're not wrong, right? Because you're getting a ton of this like outdoorsy, earthy, tobacco, cigar smoke kind of oak. It's heavy leather. It just smells like a rick house, essentially. If you guys have ever had that experience of walking into a barrel house or, a rick house in Kentucky, that's what this smells like. There's not a ton of fruit here on the nose. It's mostly just woody and caramelized sugar kind of notes. There's some vanilla, heavy chocolate, I would say, and just a really, really rich, semi-spicy kind of caramel. So there you go. Listen, I love this stuff. I really do. There are complaints lobbed at it for its proof point, being only 100 proof. So let's see if I have any complaints about that. Here we go, onto the palate now. All right, so I'm gonna continue heaping praise onto this bottle now, even though as we get into the finish, it gets a little, overly tannic. I don't want to say overly oaky, it's just that the oak quality that it has is extremely grippy. It's almost like you drank a Cabernet or a very tannic red wine when it kind of sucks the moisture out of your mouth. You get that same experience here in the finish of the Knob Creek 12. So that's an early complaint that I would lob, at this on the palate. But up front, when you first take a sip of this, it has a mouth coating and kind of oily, almost like soft and velvety experience, like when you sip it. So it's the first whiskey in this flight where I really feel like I'm getting a unique like texture to the whiskey. I mean, the 107 has a little bit of that because it's soft, it's wheated, and you kind of get that sensation. But this Knob Creek, because it's got so much oak influence to it, I think you get that softness on the front of the palate, and it's decadent, it's inviting. Now, it's definitely oaky, chocolatey, kind of like this dark, almost burnt caramel note going on in here too. A little bit of nuttiness, but really for a Jim Beam product, it's not bad. And then you get into the finish, and then the complaints can kind of start. And yes, I do wish it was higher than 100 proof. However, beggars can't be choosers. It's readily available $60 to $70 whiskey. And I think keeping value out of my mind, keeping my previous love for this bottle out of my mind as much as I can, I think this is a solid 82 out of 100. I think that if this were a little higher proof and you could reduce the tannic nature of the finish, I think this would be a superstar whiskey, which is why the 12-year cask strength that released a couple years ago and why the old store picks that were 12 to 15 years old were so highly regarded, is because it fixed all of those issues. And I think those were just substantially good whiskeys. So Knob Creek 12-year, tell me if I'm crazy, 82 out of 100. Let's move on now to a bottle that is steeped in controversy, which is the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof Batch C923, the laser code batch. And I am, guilty as charged with all the laser code stuff, although that was definitely not my intent to stir the pot the way that did. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, that's probably for the best. So this is over 130 proof. It is 13 plus years age stated. Heaven Hill, you know, the standard bourbon mash bill that they've got, I believe that's 78% corn, 12% malted barley, and 10% rye. This was kind of a fan favorite in 2023. I think probably one of the best, if not the best, modern Elijah Craig barrel proof batch from 2021 to current day, I would say. So onto the nose. Let's see if this is better or worse than the Knob Creek 12 year. So this is a very intense bourbon on the nose, and I actually think for me, coming off of this 100 proof Knob Creek and all of these others, which are, you know, a good 15 plus proof points underneath this, I actually think the Elijah Craig comes off a little bit overly hot on the nose. And maybe that's just something where I need to get this on the palate and revisit the nose to give it a fair shake because of the disparity in the proofs here. And you know, I'm not gonna hold that against it right now. So I do think it does feel a little bit hot, a little overly spicy, overly ethanol forward as well. But once you get underneath that, this is full of like jammy red fruit notes, like raspberry preserves, raspberry jam. Like I'm in that territory, sort of like a dark Luxardo cherry kind of thing. So it has the dark fruit notes that you really wanna get out of a great batch of Elijah Craig barrel proof. It has your typical baking spice notes, but then it has this great aged oak component. And that oak quality is not as funky as the Knob Creek 12, not nearly as, you know, kind of like sour almost on the nose, which then on the palate for the Knob Creek was translating to, you know, to the tannic quality. I guess the last thing I'll say about this is I do get a nice little vanilla note on the nose of this Elijah Craig barrel proof. So it's hot, it's closed off, very spicy, but that could just be because of everything it's being compared to. So let's go to the palate and then we'll talk about it some more, maybe even revisit the nose. Wow, this is powerful and spicy and enveloping and full-bodied. I mean, there's a reason people love this particular batch. Yes, it does have a lot of spice going on here. It's kind of like the nose. It's on the verge of being uncomfortable for me. However, the flavors that you get here and the rich dark fruit notes and this vanilla bean kind of quality and this almost like vanilla ice cream, almost like you took some sort of raspberry dessert with chocolate and with cherries on top and you just put a scoop of vanilla ice cream on the top of it. Like that's what I'm left with on the palate right now. It is a teeny bit drying in the finish. Some of that's to be expected with the heavy spice, you know, character, the age of the whiskey as well as the proof. I'm not gonna count that against it too much, but I do think it does have a little bit of that dryness in the finish. I would say that just as far as like the delicious factor and the intensity and the full body drinking experience, having a long finish and just fireworks. Like truly this is a fireworks whiskey where I don't think we've really had that so far in this flight. I'm gonna give this an 85 out of 100. I think that's a fair score. I think you could make the case for rating this a little bit higher. I don't think you can probably make the case for rating it much lower because it's a super solid batch. I think some of the previous like 2017, 18, 19, 20 batches might do a little bit better than the C923. But as far as like modern Heaven Hill goes, this pretty much epitomizes the best of the best before you get into like insane territory when you're talking about sourced 20-year Heaven Hill barrels from like Willett or from Oakley or from Watch Hill proper. That's a different story, and that's what the 90 plus point range is kind of reserved for. But 85 out of 100 for me, I think C923 totally deserves that. And for you laser code enthusiasts, this is A233 on the back. So now we're gonna move on to the last and, you know, maybe most special whiskey that we've got here, which is the Russell's 15 year. Now this is 117-ish proof, 15-year age statement coming from Wild Turkey. But I also wanted to include this, even though it's hard to find, you know, you gotta shell out some dollars these days for it. I wanted to include it because I think it's a great demonstration of something that's gonna go in that 90 to 100 point range. I think it's super special whiskey. I'm not gonna pull any punches and be like, I wonder if it's any good. It's friggin' awesome. So let's go to the nose and we'll talk about it here very quickly. Yeah, I mean, my God, this is like the most saturated, just antique oak, dark fruit, leathery, dusty butterscotch profile you can imagine. I think for me, there's no other modern whiskey. Yeah, I think this is a fair statement. There's no other modern produced whiskey that comes close to this profile. Like the Old Fitzgerald 13-year VVS that they did this past year, the red label Old Fitz, that was distilled in 1999 and tanked for like 10 or 11 years, something like that. So that's not modern produced whiskey. This is modern produced whiskey. So it's not a dusty. For it to have this flavor profile just boggles my mind. Like, the nose smells incredible. Now keep in mind, I'm coming off of the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof, which is super high proof. That actually makes this Russell's 15 feel a little bit more relaxed on the nose. Whereas sometimes when I smell Russell's 15, I think it can actually feel just a teeny bit tight on the nose, like it doesn't want to jump out of the glass. I don't know, that's just me. Maybe I'm crazy. I've criticized this bottle in the past and said it's a little rough around the edges and it's not perfect. But even if it's not perfect, it's damn good. So let's go to the palate. Final sip here. I don't even know what to say about this whiskey. It's just pure deliciousness in a glass. So much velvety, rich, dark, saturated fruit going on here. And it's combining so well with those kind of dustier notes. And when I say dusty, what I mean is like bourbon from the 1980s, 1990s, when you get that softness to the palate, that velvety texture, which actually I kind of talked about with the Weller 107 and a little bit with the Knob Creek 12 as well. But this takes that aspect of a whiskey's profile and just cranks it all the way up to a point where it's just so shocking to me that this is a modern whiskey and it's not something that was released back then. So yeah, listen, I could go on and on about how much I love this. I think my only complaint about this whiskey is that I feel like it could use a little bit more power to it. Like the water that was added to bring this down to proof, I genuinely think this should be like 125. If they could have left it at that proof point, I think it would be almost perfect. Because I think once you get into the finish, I think this falls off just a little bit earlier than I'd want it to. And I know that's like, it's a tough complaint to lob at this one, but I'm gonna do it because I think that you lose the spice in the finish and you lose a lot of the intensity. You are left with a lot of those dark fruit notes, almost a little like medicinal cherry kind of thing going on. But for me right now, I think this is a 95 out of 100. It's so good. I wanna drink this every day of my life. It's like a desert island kind of whiskey. And I'm being critical because it's expensive. It's hard to find. It's 15-year Russells. Like it should be critiqued. I mean, that's kind of what we're here to do. And it should be critiqued at a higher level because it's more rare, more expensive, all of those kind of things. So 95 out of 100 for this. It's right on the cusp where 96 out of 100 for me enters into the some of the best I've ever tasted category. This is right on the edge of that at 95 out of 100. So, okay, I think that covers everything. I'm gonna put all the ratings of all of these bottles back on the screen just so you guys can see them. You can, kind of look at it more holistically now. Tell me if you think I'm crazy, if any of these should be higher or lower. Let me know about my assessments as well, if you agree or disagree with some of these tasting notes. And also curious to hear what you think about, well, this video format. I think this is a little bit interesting. It's definitely gonna be a longer video. I probably talked way too much. While you're at it, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, check out the Patreon as well. I am going to probably finish up with a sip of this Russell's 15 because it's just so freaking good. So thank you guys, cheers. And the rating system, it's well on its way. Reviews coming soon with ratings attached. It's a new chapter, I guess, here for Drums and Drams. So cheers, and I'll see you guys in the next video.